Hi folks, Brian Gregg back again with another web development screencast here for Resurgence Web Design. Today we are going to be talking about Handlebars. Handlebars, the semantic templating language for JavaScript and HTML. Handlebars is a pretty well established templating language. It's definitely used in a lot of big organizations, so I think it's really important to just have some fundamental understanding of how this language works and just how semantic templating works in general, because it's definitely something that's critical for a lot of applications, not just this one particular implementation. So definitely something that's worth understanding. So what is a semantic templating language? This was something that I kind of struggled with back when I first took a look at Handlebars. I'd heard about it. I was interested in it. I took a look at it, and I really didn't understand what the purpose of it was. I understood how to make a simple application with it, and then as I started making more complex applications with it, it started to become much more clear to me why something like this would be valuable to you. So if you're just learning about this because of a job or interview question or a project that you're working on uses it, I think it's important that you understand why semantic templating language would be used in the first place. So when you think about your application, it's really important to understand that the actual implementation, the code itself, should be separated from the presentation layer. That's your whole model view controller implementation. A lot of applications support that now. And a lot of people, in order to get content that they generated in JavaScript onto the page, will use JavaScript or jQuery functions to update the HTML on the page by identifying an ID and updating the HTML content, which is definitely a viable way to do that, but it leaves one fundamental gap, and that's that whole semantic piece. If you remember at the top of the screencast, I referred to Handlebars as a semantic templating language. And what that means is that it's going to actually create templates which are meaningful to people who are looking at them who may not be familiar with the code itself. So when you create a semantic template, you're creating a template that somebody on your UI team or somebody who's working strictly on the front end could take a look at, and not even knowing what your JavaScript is doing, can clearly understand how the data is being passed, what data is being passed, and how it's going to ultimately be presented on the screen. Using jQuery or other things to update the HTML on the page requires that the person who's actually working on the code, who's working on the front end, have a clear understanding of what's going on the back end. And I mean, that could be all kinds of API calls and other logical operations that are outside of the scope of what they need to know, and having the ability to handle all of that in separate that from the actual presentation is something that's going to be hugely beneficial if you're working on a larger team. So let's take a look at an application itself. Let me just minimize my video here. Okay, so this is an actual Handlebars application that I was working on. Just a really simple one for this demonstration. And we start out at the top here with some of our standard HTML boilerplate stuff and get right into it with an ID called content. Now, this may seem a little confusing at first. This is really the extent of all the HTML on this application is just an ID called content. And when I was explaining before, I said, well, that this is a semantic templating language, and we're going to make it really easy for the UI designers and the people who are working within the context of the view itself to be able to understand what's going on. But meanwhile, we just have a div here called content, and point well taken. But the whole idea behind Handlebars is that we're actually going to create a template that's going to be populated in this div. So it's almost like a middle layer between the JavaScript application and the HTML. You now have this template which you're going to be feeding data into from JavaScript, and then taking that completed template once the JavaScript variables have been populated, and then placing that in the ID. So if you're used to using jQuery and you are used to passing HTML into a JavaScript function, think of this as taking that whole piece out and putting it into its own separate templating system. So let's take a look at what that looks like. We have a couple of links here to some scripts. We're going to be calling jQuery because jQuery, and we're going to be calling Handlebars because obviously we're talking about Handlebars here today. And here is the template itself. And you can see that the template's actually contained within a script tag. It's not going to use the JavaScript, it's going to use the xHandlebars template script type. And what you're actually going to be passing in this script is HTML. So what's going to happen is this HTML is going to be compiled by Handlebars. The Handlebars is going to update any of the embedded expressions in here with the values that are being passed to it from JavaScript, and then that content is going to be rendered on the page. You can see we have a couple of expressions in here that we're using. Really simple expressions for the purpose of this example. Obviously, we can get into some much more complicated controls once we understand some of the fundamentals here, but we're just passing two values. And you'll see in Handlebars, you always include your variables within the double curly braces. So that's going to tell Handlebars that what's following is going to be an expression and needs to be compiled, as opposed to the rest of the HTML, which is going to be just treated like regular HTML. So we're passing two values in here, one called title and one called body. And you can see that we're setting classes, we're passing them into HTML markup, and we're containing those all within a div class. You'll also notice that the script tag itself has an ID associated with it. The ID is called entry template, and that's so that we can reference it later in our JavaScript. That's pretty much it for the Handlebars template. Below that, we have our regular JavaScript, and I've put everything in one document here just for ease of reading here in this initial screencast, but as we get further along, we'll start breaking things out into their own individual files to resemble something that's a little bit more production ready. So the JavaScript itself is going to have two steps. The first step is to compile the template, and the second step down here is going to be to execute the template. The compile template piece is going to you're going to tell it where to source the template from. And as you remember, we set an ID on this script of entry template. So here we're going to set source equal to entry template, and we just use jQuery here just for simplicity's sake. And we're going to pull the HTML out of there. And then we are going to create our template by compiling it using Handlebars and passing it to the Handlebars compile function. And this will then take that, it will take that template and put it into a format that can then be rendered within the JavaScript itself. We then create a context variable here. This context variable is an object, and that object can be really as complex as you want it to be. We're really just passing two values into this. This can be an array of objects. It can be objects of multiple levels of depth, and it can be this here. It's just some static content that I put in here. But obviously, if you're writing a JavaScript application, you can populate this dynamically with data that you're pulling in from an API or data that's being rendered on the server, and then passing it to your Handlebars template. And we'll look at some examples of that in some later screencasts. Lastly, what we're going to do is we're going to actually take the context that we just created, and we're going to pass it into our template function from up top here. And remember that that template was already compiled with the source that we had pulled in from our template up top here. So that is going to create our HTML. And then, again, using jQuery, we're going to target the content ID on the page, which we set up here. And we're going to call the HTML function from jQuery, and we're going to pass the newly rendered HTML. That's pretty much it for the application. You can see here that the application, when it's run in the browser, it's going to render that title and body that we passed. If we inspect this, we can see that it's going to match exactly the template that we defined here. So we have a div of class entry, and well, let's start with the div ID content, which is the target. So we have our div ID content, and then within it, we have the div with class of entry, which we see right here, the h1 of title, h1, which takes the value that we had in our context called title, and the body, which is going to take the content which we set for body because it is being rendered in this this embedded expression right here. And that's pretty much it. Those are the major components of a Handlebars application. This would be enough to at least give you an understanding to kind of play around with this and see what else you can do with it. And I'll be back with some more content in the near future, going over some more concepts of putting controls in place and defining some additional capabilities for this application. All right. Thank you very much. If you have questions, hit me up on Twitter, Ignore Intuition, or on my YouTube channel, and I'm more than happy to help you out. All right. Happy coding.